I'm Dr. Marie Morsky, and just a small bio about myself. I'm a physician and attorney, and on the medical side, I'm a family medicine physician trained at the Mayo Clinic, and I spent 9 years of my clinical years working at the Veterans Administration, seeing servicemen and women as they were leaving the military. And in that time is when I discovered psychedelic medicine, both as a field and also in my own healing journey. And as I was going to work and seeing these men and women who I had, many of whom had issues that I knew psychedelic medicines could address, but I was not able to talk about them because I was a Department of Defense employee, it became a lot of a struggle because as physicians, our oath that we take is to first do no harm. And I felt I was doing a lot of harm by omission. So when I left the VA in May of 2019, I made it my mission to spread the word about these medicines, not only to patients, but primarily to the people whose job it is to care for those patients. And that's our frontline medical providers. I could see that the majority of my colleagues, I have physician colleagues from social circles and from medical school, the majority of them did not know even about the psychedelic medicines like ketamine that are available now. And definitely they had not heard of any of the ones that were coming. And so I started plantmedicine.org and the Plant Medicine podcast. And about 6 months in, I realized podcasts are not how doctors get their medical information. And so that's where the idea for the association came, because that's how physicians keep up to date on a lot of their areas of study, et cetera. Now, the tiny elephant in the room here is that I have called it the Psychedelic Medicine Association. But those of you who are in traditional medicine generally know that associations are named after the people who are doing the thing in the association. So the American Urologic Association is full of urologists. The Psychedelic Medicine Association is not full of people doing psychedelic medicine. We welcome those people in, but our main goal is to educate the doctors who do not yet know about psychedelic medicines or are just learning about psychedelic medicines, to educate them on the full breadth of what's here and what's coming. So I called it the Psychedelic Medicine Association because Association for Doctors Who Don't Yet Know About Psychedelics But Should was kind of an unwieldy title, but please forgive me if the actual title is a little bit confusing. We definitely want providers who are still in that learning space or this may be the first they're hearing about it, though we also want providers who are working in psychedelic medicine to come in and join us. Now, another little point about the association is that this is not the American or the Canadian Psychedelic Medicine Association. This is a global organization. We want people from all different parts of the world to come and help work on this, on overcoming these hurdles to getting these medicines out to people together. We can all learn from each other. And in that same spirit, since we're not an organization from one country or another, we're not doing certifications or credentialing or anything. There are assuredly associations that will pop up to take care of that. We are focusing just on educating those doctors who may never plan to do psychedelic medicine, but who are on that front line of care, that primary care doctor that you first see if you're having an issue. Our primary focus is on educating them. Now, you may have noticed that the Psychedelic Medicine Association, there's a platform on our site. And so members get to go in and interact in that forum. And we've invited other stakeholders in the psychedelic industry, organizations that are working on policy, organizations that are doing research, to come join us because we're focused on educating the physicians. But there's so many other things that need to take place so that we can get these medicines to patients. Like, how do we get them covered by insurance? Or how do we change policy so that these patients aren't in any kind of legal danger when they use these medicines? So by bringing everybody together, hopefully we can speed up implementation of those kinds of changes that need to take place so that we can get equitable access to these medicines for all. So now, to start this discussion on how to work toward these goals, we brought together 3 esteemed panelists from across the psychedelic world. We had a little change of plans today, and so we are very grateful that Dr. Elizabeth Nielsen is able to step up and join us today. She is co-founder of Fluence. Dr. Nielsen is a co-founder of Fluence and a psychologist with a focus on developing psychedelic medicines as treatment for PTSD, substance use problems, and mood disorders. Dr. Nielsen is also a therapist on FDA-approved clinical trials of psilocybin-assisted treatment of alcohol use disorder, MDMA-assisted treatment of PTSD, and psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Having completed an NIH postdoctoral fellowship at NYU, she has published and presented on topics of psychedelic therapist training, therapist personal experience with psychedelics, and psychedelic integration in group and individual psychotherapy. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Nielsen. We also have Dr. Devin Christie, the medical director of Numinous. Dr. Christie is medical director with Numinous Wellness, Inc., a company creating an ecosystem of health solutions centered around safe, evidence-based, accessible use of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies. She is both a family doctor and registered therapeutic counselor with a focused practice in chronic pain and emphasis in relational somatic therapy for trauma resolution. Additionally, she is a MAPS-trained therapist for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, certified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher, and functional medicine practitioner. Devin is an instructor at the CIIS Certificate in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies and Research Postgraduate Program. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Christie. And we also have Sean McAllister, who is founding attorney at McAllister Garfield and executive officer of the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel. Sean is an attorney specializing in the intersection of regulatory and corporate law. He's been a leader in the emerging industries of cannabis, hemp, and psychedelics. Sean is licensed to practice law in Colorado and California. With over 20 years practicing law, Sean has represented therapists and doctors interested in engaging in psychedelic-assisted therapy, advise clients on what is allowed in cities that have decriminalized psychedelics, advise clients looking to obtain a religious exemption from criminal law for the use of psychedelics under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and is advising companies entering into the emerging psychedelic space. He's general counsel for the Decriminalize Denver campaign around psilocybin mushrooms, legal advisor to the Decriminalize Psilocybin California 2020 campaign, and general counsel to the Chacruna Institute for Plant-Based Medicines. Welcome, Sean, and welcome to all of the panelists. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Now, to give just a little context before we start, for those of you who aren't in the medical field, I'd like to present a few scenarios of what it may look like when the psychedelic worlds and Western medical worlds interact. In most medical paradigms, the primary care physician or other person in a primary care role is the first person that a patient sees when they're having a medical concern. But at present, most of our primary care physicians do not have any knowledge about psychedelics therapies. So it can look like this. Now, I'm going to use ketamine as an example because ketamine is available and legal now. And so these scenarios are currently possible. Number one, a patient's got depression and they go to their primary care doctor and they've maybe tried all the other therapies and they say, I'm having a real hard time. Can we please look into getting me ketamine treatments? And if that physician is not aware that ketamine is used currently for treatment-resistant depression, they may think, well, for example, in my training, the only time I used ketamine was in pediatrics for anesthetizing little kids that came into the ER. So they might think, well, that's just an anesthetic. What are you talking about it for depression? Or they may not feel like they know enough to feel comfortable talking about this with the patient and recommending it. And so that patient doesn't get the ketamine that they could benefit from. That's scenario one. Scenario two, the patient comes in with depression, doesn't know ketamine is a therapy, and the provider doesn't know ketamine is a therapy. And so a patient who could benefit from it still doesn't get that therapy. Now, the third scenario is where they go in and maybe the doctor does know about ketamine therapy, but it's prohibitively expensive. Ketamine therapy can cost thousands of dollars. And so the patient still isn't getting the treatment that they need. And the fourth and final scenario is, let's use a different medicine. Say a patient is going to do an ibogaine treatment in a country where it's legal, and they go and they tell their primary care doctor, I'm going to go do this treatment. If the doctor doesn't know to go through the chart and make sure that the patient doesn't have certain cardiac arrhythmias, then it's not completely safe for that patient to be undergoing the ibogaine treatment because that doctor doesn't know that certain things that the patient may have are contraindications to using ibogaine. So those are four scenarios that could be presenting themselves right now, and they need to be addressed so that we can get these patients the treatment that they need, but also in a very safe manner. So we're going to get this conversation started. Let's see, we have Dr. Christie here with us. We're going to start with a question for you, Dr. Christie. What do you see are some of the biggest hurdles to getting primary care providers comfortable with psychedelic medicines? And do you have any suggested solutions to overcome these hurdles?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really important question. I just got a pop-up up on my screen. There we go. And something that's relevant right now, as you say, I mean, I was just speaking on a panel a week ago, And one of the questions from the audience was, I went and talked to my primary care provider about psilocybin and they just dismissed me and rolled their eyes, kind of thing. So I think there are primarily, there's the barrier of stigma, of course. Many people, when they hear the word psychedelic, which we've chosen to bring forward as a collective, you know, as the terminology and the research, there's other terms, hallucinogen and others, but really the psychedelic we're carrying it forward regardless of stigma and in hopes of changing that. So, you know, that can conjure images of counterculture, anti-establishment, flower children, whatever that may be. And stigma has an emotional valence to it. So that's definitely a hurdle in itself. There's also fears and misconceptions that I think need to be addressed. And finally, really just the bandwidth of primary care providers. So I can speak to each of those separately. I mean, for stigma, as far as solutions, my thinking is that to overcome that level of hurdle where there's that emotional valence and perhaps a filtering of where one's putting one's attention or where one's even motivated to place their attention, I think what needs to happen is several streams of influence need to come together really to create a window of opportunity for that level of change. And so we already have patients coming forward, asking questions. We also have media that's presenting some of the data. You know, there's been a lot of positive reporting recently about some of the emergent data from scientific trials with psychedelic assisted therapies. And I think the other channels that can add to these, that can be very influential for primary care providers, are going to be circles of influence within their profession. So that would be professional bodies. So maybe there's an annual meeting of a psychiatrist association, and somebody's presenting on this topic, someone who's an influential thought leader and respected amongst colleagues. I think that's where we start to see people really going, well, okay, if my respected colleagues are talking about this, then maybe it's something for me to consider. And then another stream of influence that I think is important, but is also a challenge, or at least just something that's emerging at the moment, is regulatory bodies. So governing bodies, be that here in Canada, provincial health authorities, our government, the laws around these substances. And as those begin to shift as well, according to data and outcomes, I think when these streams come together, there will be a window of opportunity to overcome stigma. And on the topic of fear and misconception, that's something that came up for me a few years ago. I was presenting to colleagues on this topic, on the psychedelic renaissance and the data and the sort of history, recent history and ancient history of the use of psychedelic substances. And one of the anesthesiologists in the group was very concerned that once these substances are approved, they're going to be just doled out willy-nilly, you know, just like any other prescription. And this is where there's such a huge piece of education that needs to happen, because we're actually talking about a total paradigm shift in how mental health is addressed and in how we're using medicines. The answer is not in the medicine. It's not about palliating symptoms. These medicines are being used very sparingly, like in the MAPS protocol for PTSD, a total of 3 times. And the medicine is not, it's an adjunct to a therapeutic process that has so many other contextual factors around it. And I think that needs to click in terms of understanding that we can think of this as something more like a specialized procedure, not like a drug that's just going to be prescribed willy-nilly for patient home use or something like that. You know, really, physicians just don't know. So that's a really important key message. And I think also just that we're bringing psychotherapy back into a field that's been largely dominated by biological psychiatry and really reductionism and neurotransmitters, and that it's actually the combination of the two, bringing a potent medicine and a change process of psychotherapy together. That's really what we're seeing is delivering the change. So education, obviously, and then finally, just the piece about limited capacity. I think as a primary care doctor, I've focused my practice, as you mentioned, in chronic pain. But as I was juggling family practice in rural British Columbia, there are so many things that I need to keep up on all the time. It's such a broad scope. So unless there's a particular topic that has direct relevance or something tangible for me to be responding to in relation to my patients, it just doesn't necessarily get the bandwidth, of my attention. So I think as we see things evolve and as these substances and psychedelic assisted therapies are coming through into clinical practice in the next few years, it will become more relevant because it will become more tangible. And that's where we need to look to the field of implementation science and knowledge translation, which, whether you're talking about psychedelics or any other new innovation in healthcare, there are hurdles. And there may be special hurdles for psychedelics, like I just spoke to, but it's something I think we'll all have to put our heads together around.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Christie. I absolutely agree. And on that topic of education, like you mentioned, I'd like to move to Dr. Nielsen. In the training programs that you've created to start this education of clinicians, what are some of the techniques you found most helpful in imparting this massive field of ever-evolving information?
Thank you, Lynn Marie. That's a great place to start. So maybe I'll just give a little bit of background. As a clinical psychologist who's worked in the field of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic research studies for several years now, my business partner and I, Ingmar Gorman and I, founded Fluence about a year ago. After several more years prior to that, running workshops and teaching in this field. And the reason that we were doing this is because we were noticing a lot of therapists and a lot of clinicians coming to us to ask how they could get training in this field, how they could get knowledge, how they could get skills specifically, both for working with patients who had questions about this area, working with patients that had taken psychedelics and wanted help integrating those experiences, and for really becoming psychedelic assisted therapy therapists proper. So we created a training program to try to help address that gap, and also to help try to help address disparities in healthcare, disparities in the availability of psychedelic medicine, through offering a broader variety of training opportunities, and therefore opportunities to a broader variety of people. One thing that I think has been sort of systemic about the way psychedelic research has mostly gone thus far is that, being as it's taking place mostly in major institutions as well as within an established system, it tends to opt in the people that are already highly excelled in that established system. But we know that system does not necessarily represent all of the people who need this kind of medicine. So we started this training program. It's completely independent, and we really, came from a place of wishing to make better access to education. And some of the ways that we do that are by offering programs that are online, programs that have flexible study schedules, flexible dates, as well as some in-person programs that we'll go back to after once COVID restrictions ease just a little bit more. And offering a range of options. So everything from, a single one evening free webinar to, a longer, more in-depth study for people who really want to specialize and really want to make this the core aspect of their career. And I think there are going to be various levels of interest and various levels of engagement, and that we can welcome people across a spectrum of levels of interest and engagement. Not everyone has to be, a specialized psychedelic therapist as the full bulk of their career and their work in order to do something really helpful and useful here. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Lynn, your mic is muted.
Thanks, Lynn.
I asked the people behind the scenes to unmute everybody who was speaking, and that muted me. Okay, sorry. So thank you for that, Dr. Nielsen. I think that's a good point, is that we're not asking these clinicians to take this over and make this their practice. It's just like any new emerging area of medicine that is very applicable to their patients. It's just good to have a base level knowledge, but a breadth of knowledge, because again, it's not enough to just know what they are. You need to know a little bit more, like contraindications, et cetera, or at least know when to refer to somebody else who's more specialized in that field. So thank you for the work that you guys are doing.
And some people will want to fully specialize in this and do a full postgraduate program of study. That's kind of where our training program is positioned. But there are a lot of opportunities for more, for the kind of regular knowledge that you would want on a daily basis when someone comes in with a few real basic questions just to get started.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Now, Sean, this brings up a good point where we're talking about, physicians who may be going from zero as far as their psychedelic knowledge, and they're still learning. I mean, we're all still learning because the field is ever evolving, but at least in the US, and I assume other places, but definitely in the US, where there's a very litigious society around the medical profession, and physicians are very often practicing in this, we're very like this, cover ourselves from litigation standpoint that makes us, I think, more conservative than we would be otherwise. Can you discuss some ways that physicians who are still learning about a topic can discuss it with patients without putting themselves in legal jeopardy?
Thanks, Lynn Marie Morsky, for having me here at the Psychedelic Medicine Association launch. A real honor for me to be involved in this, and thank you for all your work over the last several years, bringing spotlight to this issue. Yes, look, Dr. Christie was talking earlier about the stigma and the barriers for doctors and therapists and psychologists, psychiatrists to get involved with psychedelic-assisted therapy or medicine. I definitely think the stigma is a huge problem, but also the legal barriers are probably one of the primary barriers for anybody to feel comfortable getting involved. Because as we know, ketamine is certainly legal in the United States, a Schedule III drug, and there are certainly standards of care that allow doctors to prescribe it off-label. But all the other psychedelic medicines, entheogenic, all the other names we have for it, all those medicines are either in clinical trials and not fully legal in the United States, or just frankly, Schedule I drugs that are illegal. And so I definitely, in my practice, have been talking to doctors and therapists, and that's their primary concern is, well, what can I do here? What can I talk to patients about? How do I get involved in a clinical trial? I mean, clearly the most legal thing for therapists or doctors to do would be to prescribe ketamine within a standard of care for a condition that's appropriate for ketamine, or if they could participate in a clinical trial for psilocybin or MDMA, or I guess eventually iboga is in clinical trials now. So if they could do those two things, they're acting perfectly legal and there's no legal concerns. But what about talking about psilocybin or LSD or peyote or other hallucinogens that are all Schedule I substances in the United States? This is where some of my background in cannabis comes in handy, because we certainly have dealt with this issue in cannabis for a long time. Doctors have been talking to patients about cannabis, which is a Schedule I drug still in the United States, despite its legality at the state level. And I also always like to point people to this case, Conant v. Walters, which I went ahead and put in the chat box here. Now, this is just a West Coast Ninth Circuit decision in the United States, but it basically said that doctors have the First Amendment right to talk to their patients about anything they believe would benefit that patient, even if it's federally illegal. So clearly prescribing something that's federally illegal could jeopardize a doctor's licensure or its DEA Schedule I license. But that's not what a lot of these doctors and therapists are doing. They want to just talk to a patient about, have you heard about ayahuasca in South America, which is legal in certain countries, or psilocybin in Jamaica, which is legal, or psilocybin in Amsterdam. And so, I'm clearly here. I am the lawyer saying, I'm not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. But to the extent that I want to give educational information here, I think people can feel free to speak to patients about the issues around psychedelics and their specific condition. The thing that starts running the risk for doctors or therapists is when they are actually facilitating the acquisition of these substances that are illegal. there's kind of three phases of psychedelic assisted therapy or medicine. There's the preparation work, the actual therapy itself, and then integration. Of those three, clearly integration work is legal, and there's nothing unethical or that breaches a standard of care to talk to a patient about, oh, you did psilocybin, how is that affecting you? Tell me what happened. This is purely legal behavior. It's those other activities, if you're helping a patient prepare or even acquire the drug, again, unless it's ketamine or in a clinical trial, that's the legal barrier that is dissuading a lot of doctors and therapists from getting involved. So we have a long way to go. We're really at the very beginning of this movement here. But despite 40 years of effort, we're finally putting some cracks in the walls here. It's time to start talking to our regulating bodies. It's time to start talking about the standard of care. Time to do what Dr. Nielsen is doing and create self-regulating standards that could become third-party certification of the standard of care that doctors and therapists are performing under. And time to start changing laws. We ultimately have 70-year-old laws on a lot of these substances that don't reflect modern science. They don't reflect compassion and actual need in our society with record levels of depression and anxiety. So that's a lot of what I've been involved in, is literally trying to change the laws so we can protect therapists and doctors so they can't lose a license. The California initiative I helped draft, which looks like it will be on the ballot again in 2022, it won't make the ballot this year, would specifically protect doctors and therapists who engage in psychedelic assisted therapy from losing a state license. But right now, that remains a risk if you're doing those preparatory or actual therapeutic processes with the Schedule I outside of a legal regime. That's a major barrier that is dissuading a lot of people from being involved.
Well, thank you for that, Sean. That's super helpful to know. And I do appreciate that talk about integration, because absolutely, like once you've gone, if you're a patient and you've gone and done these medicines, there's absolutely no concern to come back and talk to your doctor. Your doctor should feel completely comfortable knowing what you've done. And what we're trying to do is create this world where patients and their doctors have the kind of communication that they need to have to take the best care of the patient. Like if you're holding something back from your physician, you're not getting the best care and they're not able to do their best job. And so we want a world where that discussion can be an open, transparent one. Nothing has to be hidden for any type of reason. So Sean, I appreciate the work that you're doing on that front to make sure that that is a possibility for us. All right, Dr. Christie.
I actually, Lynn did send me this question ahead of time, so I know where she's going with it. I could certainly just pick it up where she left off. So she was wondering what types of things are most crucial for frontline healthcare providers to understand about these therapies in order for communication between primary care doctors and these psychedelic specialists to carry forward. There she is, Lynn. You're back. We lost you there for a minute. So I was just reviewing the question. I took the baton, so I can go ahead and carry it forward. You were drawing this great analogy between thinking of these therapeutics almost like a surgery. Obviously, a primary care doctor doesn't have all of the information about a surgeon, and certainly they wouldn't about a surgery, and they wouldn't try to do it in their office without, when they're lacking all of that specialized information. So what do primary care doctors need to understand to communicate with specialists that are delivering psychedelic therapies? Well, number one, I think, is who would be an appropriate candidate for referral. I think that's really what primary care doctors want to understand is how can I responsibly make the right referrals? And, just there's a certain amount of knowledge about mental health and understanding the available therapies to address mental health issues that physicians will need to have, and that will have to be inclusive of psychedelic assisted therapies. And I really see that going forward, the training for all physicians, whether they specialize or become family doctors, the core rotations that we all do in medical school. We rotate through every field so that we can get that exposure. And what I see and what I think is necessary is for psychedelic assisted therapies to become a very normalized exposure that doctors will have when they're rotating through psychiatry, so that you can have that hands-on and that really understanding this is part of medical practice. This is not fringe. So of course we're a ways off from that still, but that really should be where we're looking as a field to be incorporating these therapies in. And I also think, the surgery analogy is very apropos, because as I was saying earlier, there's all these contextual elements of the set and setting that are crucial for the outcomes and the safety for the administration of psychedelic assisted medicines, which one of our viewers in the chat box has echoed. It's a catalyst to a healing process that involves a lot of other factors, and ultimately is something essential to the person, that healing process. Just like when your skin heals from a cut, it does that. We can create the right conditions so that it doesn't get infected and all of those things. So we need to think about psychedelic therapies that way, and that there's a curative intent, not a palliating intent. And I think that physicians really need to understand that, so that there's that common knowledge in communication with those that are delivering these therapies, and so that primary care doctors can speak to these treatments and put them in the right context for patients. Because again, I think patients are also very conditioned to almost be passive recipients of healthcare in our current system as it is. And I think a lot of that comes from the germ theory of disease and this idea of silver bullets and the ideas of pharmaceutical drugs as being something you just take and you're passive. And that's a real shift that I think is fortunate that we're making, because it actually is ultimately empowering, but it's also going to require a level of understanding that there's motivation and there's a lot of participation involved to really engage these medicines and receive the benefits of them that we're seeing in the clinical trials.
So this next question is for Dr. Nielsen. By the way, thank you, Dr. Christie, for that. Dr. Nielsen, as one of the most prolific therapists for both MDMA and psilocybin trials, do you have a sense of how patients are getting their information about these therapies, and what kinds of discussions they're currently having with their primary care docs about their participation in these psychedelic medicine studies?
Well, that's a complex question, but I think that's you. Okay, well, we'll try again. Thank you for that question. It's interesting. I think that a lot of people who are coming into clinical trials, and this is just my sort of anecdotal sense, is that a lot of people are hearing about it because they're seeking an alternative or experimental treatment for the particular diagnostic category that the trial is studying. So they may have heard of psychedelic therapies and psychedelic medicine research, and they may be aware of the all that we're talking about here in terms of the cultural paradigm shift and the history, etc. But a lot of people are, looking because they're looking for an alternative treatment. The existing treatments have not worked for them, or they have not worked adequately to where that person is feeling that they are no longer in need of treatment. And so they're seeing this as, an additional alternative. And I really want to position that, because I think that, there can be the misconception or the idea that this is something that people seek because perhaps they're seeking psychedelic experiences. But really, we're seeing people that are seeking treatment and seeking healthcare. And I think that perhaps speaks to some of the stigma about psychedelics. We're used to, perhaps a lot of people are used to thinking of them as, drugs that have this history of, potential for dangerous associations, or not for medical use, or recreational use associations. And it can be really easy for physicians or other clinical care providers who are unfamiliar with the research to conclude that people would be seeking this for those sorts of reasons, but people are really seeking it because they're suffering. And then the interesting conversation can come up sometimes where someone will come looking for a study to come into a study for this experimental treatment. And perhaps their physician doesn't know about it, or their psychiatrist doesn't know about it. So the study clinicians and the study itself is a chance to maybe have a conversation with that individual and let them know about it. Lots of people have supportive healthcare providers. Lots of people have healthcare providers that are simply unaware of this, and so they are learning about it as their patient is, perhaps engaging with it. And there have probably been the rare few whose healthcare providers have not had a supportive reaction. We don't tend to, be the ones that would be engaging with us. But I do think that, just as far as the way that clinical trials are positioned, primary care physicians who are educated about them and other healthcare providers who are educated about the clinical trials know what clinical trials are available, what some of the potential scenarios about being involved in a clinical trial are like, and they can offer those. You can offer those to your patients. You can offer those to people coming in. Hey, I know you've tried the things that I would normally suggest. There is this clinical trial. There's this experimental treatment. We don't know yet. It's not approved yet, but it's a possibility in terms of getting some care. So I'd love to see more healthcare providers educated about that as an opportunity.
Lynn, could I jump in on that and just add some comments? I have a little bit of a social science background before becoming a lawyer, so I want to make some comments that hopefully dovetail with Dr. Christie and Dr. Nielsen's comments, which is, look, the truth is, Dr. Christie said this has been seen as counterculture, and that's true in the United States because we didn't have a cultural container for the use of psychedelics in a healing manner. So thankfully, indigenous people have retained some cultural context for these medicines around the world, whether it's the Bwiti people in Africa or the Shipibo in South America. And, what I think we're all dealing with is the fact that in Western society, the truth is doctors and psychologists, they are our shamans. They are our healers. And so that's the natural cultural container that these medicines fit into. I think eventually we have to build a true culture of wellness that might replicate some indigenous traditions, and we could expand the concept of wellness beyond just the sick and the ailing. That psychedelics actually, I think there's a lot of evidence they're good for healthy people as well. And so I just wanted to mention that because I think what doctors and psychologists are dealing with ketamine in particular is how far can you go off label with ketamine? What is an acceptable application of that drug or future drugs? And what I've seen, without disclosing any names, obviously, is there's some psychiatrists out there and psychologists that say they're starting to prescribe ketamine under a DSM diagnosis of psychospiritual exploration. That's not illness at all. That's just someone that says, I have an existential question about life. How do I address that? And so they're off-labeling ketamine as far as non sort of debilitating condition. And I think that's the struggle that doctors and therapists are going to have in coming years is as these drugs come from FDA, it's going to be MDMA and then psilocybin and then iboga. What can we prescribe those for? And I think it just dovetails with what everyone has said, because we're going to have to really set some standards within the medical community about what's acceptable and perhaps expand that definition of what is acceptable to include wellness. And so I just wanted to make those comments.
Thank you for that, Sean. I appreciate you adding that. The next question we want to go to on that same front, I'm glad you brought that up, Sean, is like the larger context of these. I want to pose this to Dr. Christie, because we talk about your average medicine, like if somebody's got high cholesterol, okay, you go take Lipitor. There's no more that they need to know. They go home and they take this medicine and it's over. I'm sorry, this question is for Dr. Nielsen. Forgive me, I misquoted. So with these psychedelic therapies, there are so many more esoteric components, like the set and setting and the integration that we talked about, and like how Sean just mentioned, these indigenous traditions that support certain medicines. So any thoughts, from your education background on how we may be able to educate clinicians on this wider view of what's involved in psychedelic therapy?
That's a really great point, and I think this pertains more to people who are going to want to really take that deep dive and dedicate a portion of their practice to providing harm reduction and integration therapy and or psychedelic assisted therapy proper. So there are a couple of things that come to mind that we include in our training programs that I can mention. Certainly one of them is to really allow people the space and time to get to know the variety of what's out there in the field. So we do that through a lot of community networking, a lot of exposure to different writers, different topics, and really try to help people get a bit more oriented to the overall field. We can't provide every piece of knowledge that could possibly be associated with this kind of work, but we try to help people get connected with the kinds of resources that can support ongoing learning and really get a lay of the land and understand, what the reliable sources are and who are some writers that they might want to follow if they want to kind of continue exploring these topics. Another really important aspect of training, especially for people that are engaging in psychedelic integration work and psychedelic assisted therapy, is the aspect of experiential training. And by that, I mean experiencing non-ordinary states of consciousness and then working with those to integrate them oneself. In our training programs, we use contemplative practices for this very purpose. So we engage people in brief meditative practices, slightly longer meditative practices at retreats, and then we use that experience to practice the skills of integration both with each other and ourselves, bringing those insights into our life and figuring out how do we want to act on them, how do we want to actually grow in relation to them. And that's a very personal process, but I think that going through that, taking those steps oneself in a way that is personal and may give some insight into what it's like for patients to go through that process. So those types of experiences are aligned with what's happening in most research training protocols, where people are using, for instance, breathwork experiences and meditative experiences to gain that type of insight that's very particular to this. And again, this is really for people that want to take that deep dive and really make this a core piece of their practice.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, Dr. Nielsen. Thank you for your work in that, in helping clinicians understand that wider range of things that are present in this field. Dr. Christie, one of the features of the Psychedelic Medicine Association is a forum in which stakeholders in the industry can interact with healthcare providers directly. In our current medical model, as you know, the only communication clinicians generally have with the pharmaceutical companies is usually through drug reps, who are neither healthcare providers nor the scientists responsible for making the drugs. So as the medical director of Numinous, one of the companies who will be manufacturing these psychedelic medicines, what do you see as the benefit of bringing together companies such as yours with the clinicians who may be prescribing these therapies?
Yeah, good. I hope you can hear me. As I mentioned in my other answers, just to reiterate the uniqueness of these therapies and the particular considerations around the delivery setting, all of the preparation, the psychotherapeutic work, the context of the sessions themselves, the integration, that is it's a very clinical model. Most drugs that a drug rep brings forward to any doctor, prescribing doctor, really they're communicating, the dose range, the dose schedule, some very basic information, contraindications, the indications, whereas with these medicines or these therapies, there's so much more involved. So that's where we see organizations like MAPS, who have been bringing MDMA forward, they've developed a therapist training, not only in the efforts for their phase 3 expansion to multi-sites and the completion of the evidence generation for approval of MDMA, but also for moving forward into expanded access in the USA and beyond. That I've heard Rick Doblin speak about how prescribing physicians who are going to be allowed to prescribe MDMA would need to complete the therapist training, so they actually have, even if they aren't delivering the therapy, this is an interdisciplinary practice as well, right? You're bringing in therapists as well as prescribers, possibly nurses, other folks. So it's quite a treatment paradigm to be orchestrating. So I think that on the ground clinician level of clinician to clinician contact and translation of the best practices and the safest practices is going to be necessary. It's why with Numinous, we are embarking on implementation science. So we will be rolling out two in here in Canada. They're called compassionate access studies, where it's a single arm open label study looking at MDMA, as well as another study with psilocybin, so that we can not only be providing access to people who need these within a research context before approval, but also gathering more safety information and continuing to learn about how we can move these research protocols into a clinical practice model. And what do we need to carry over from the research context? What might be able to be changed? But I really do think that clinicians that are involved, for example, with MAPS, they're very, very important in translating the information about how to deliver these therapies and how to do that safely. So again, they're not like any other drug. They require a lot of special considerations, and that clinician to clinician involvement and training, like Elizabeth is doing, and Ingmar, who is actually in my MDMA training cohort with MAPS. I know Ingmar. That it's so important for. And I think, vertical integration in a company like Numinous, where we do have a bioscience arm to our company, that we may in the future be producing a product that could be used in our Numinous Health, clinical model. We also have to look at important issues of conflict of interest that may arise, or other ethical considerations as well, and perhaps collectively be able to draw appropriate boundaries and make sure that patients, of course, have choice and are not subject to bias, and all of those things are considered. So lots to consider there.
Thank you very much for that. And we appreciate that perspective. Yeah, there are a lot of those means of communication that I think are going to be really helpful, that we've gotten it started from the beginning, so that it's not like we are with, Pfizer, where it's just unidirectional communication. I'm really glad that companies such as yourself are willing to come in and have those discussions with clinicians from the beginning. Next question is for Sean. With your background in several decriminalization projects, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how gathering clinicians together in this format could be helpful in further decriminalization and legalization efforts.
All right, I like this provoking question. I do want just 20 seconds on what Dr. Christie was saying. Everybody, I'm sure, understands, as she said, that this rollout of psychedelic medicines, if we're really going to treat depression, anxiety, all the other conditions they could address, addiction, this is what I've heard is we need 40,000 MDMA therapists or something enormous. So, the task is really enormous. And a lot of people are focusing on this issue of the protocol for how to deliver these medicines. A lot of my clients are working on it now. MAPS has a protocol. I know I've talked to Compass. They're talking about certain proprietary, delivery methods. Numinous is going to do this. Other clients of mine that have retreat centers already around psilocybin. So there's going to be a lot of energy into that, and appropriately so, because it's not just as simple as Dr. Christie said, as giving out a prescription. That there's a lot, I think the most important work is the integration work. Okay, so with that said, since you all therapists and doctors have so much invested in this, how can you help with decriminalization or legalization initiatives? Yeah, I just want to give people the 2-minute overview that yet again, we're going to see parallel paths like we did with cannabis, with some FDA process or regulatory legalization process going side by side with citizen initiatives that take the lead without the science. And you've certainly seen that in psychedelics already, with Denver decriminalizing psilocybin, Oakland, Santa Cruz. It's on the ballot this year in Washington, D.C. The most important ballot initiative is in Oregon. Measure 109 in Oregon will create treatment centers, therapy centers for psilocybin. You do not have to be a doctor or a psychologist to become a provider in Oregon. You do have to be licensed by the Oregon Health Authority under standards to be determined. But the point is that activists have said, those medicine keepers with 20, 30 years of trip sitting and spiritual practice around these substances, they're just as equipped as doctors and therapists to provide this medicine. And so, again, you're going to see these state initiatives roll out that have a big impact and have some dovetailing with what the medical community is doing. And the most important thing is clearly just to get involved. I could say I helped draft this California psilocybin initiative this year. We're working in Colorado on a potential 2022 ballot initiative, and there's more drafting to be done. And we need input from doctors, psychiatrists, and therapists on what their needs are. I think we have some sense of it. But, for example, the California initiative started off as a very simple decriminalization initiative that would have just said psilocybin is decriminalized, no criminal activity, no criminal conduct associated with psilocybin. As we got into it, I think some very established groups, I probably shouldn't say who, some United Kingdom-oriented, psilocybin-oriented players, you could probably imagine who those are, got in touch with the campaign and said, you really should do something to protect therapists in this process, not just general decrim. And so by the end of the drafting process in California, we had a provision saying you cannot take a therapist license or doctor or medical provider's license away for engaging in psychedelic assisted therapy around psilocybin. And so that's an important protection that wouldn't have been there if we hadn't have got input from the medical community. In Oregon, which is the first major opportunity to see a statewide vote, first of all, as difficult as that initiative is, it's not perfect. It doesn't decriminalize home possession or use, although there's another initiative that would decriminalize all drugs in Oregon. But as difficult as Measure 109 has been for some advocates, if it passes, first we ought to support it, I think. But if it passes, there's going to be a whole stakeholder process with the Oregon Health Authority that's going to be setting these kind of standards. And so therapists can get involved and doctors can get involved. You don't have to be an Oregon resident under Measure 109 to go to Oregon and provide psilocybin therapy. So there might be a way, if you telemedicine or being able to, again, depends on your licensure and I'm not giving you legal advice, but there might be a way certainly for therapists and maybe doctors to do provision under the Oregon law. And then there's other measures out there, like Oakland has not now gone to a next step of saying, okay, after decriminalization, what we want is the Oakland Community Healing Initiative, which is having the city register facilitators and participants to gain legal protection in the city of Oakland for providing psychedelics. It's just another example of this grassroots activism that if we don't have doctors and therapists putting their wisdom into this, we're going to get kind of weird systems. And there's some people that are concerned about this Oakland thing. It's, community-based organizations, traditional facilitators. So my point is, get involved in Bay Area or other cities' activism and make sure that the therapist voice is heard. One more thing, we're very fortunate here in Colorado to have the NOAC Society, which is a conglomeration of therapists that care about psychedelic assisted therapy. So come together with groups like yours, Psychedelic Medicine Association, and then at the local level, because in the next 2 to 3 years, you could see 3 to 4 states in major cities with some form of legalized psilocybin or other psychedelics. And if we don't get your input, you may not like the output. So I do definitely encourage people to get involved and look at some of the other organizations that we've mentioned, MAPS, Chacruna, Drug Policy Alliance, local organizations that are working on this.
Thank you for that, Sean. I appreciate that. Yes, please get involved if you are in this field and in one of those areas. Like you said, it's better to get involved on the front end and help shape this. And so that's part of what I want to discuss in the 3 minutes we have left. I appreciate everybody who put questions in the Q&A. The Psychedelic Medicine Association is a forum. And so in that forum, members can ask these questions. Everybody on this panel, their organizations are in that forum. And because these are great questions, and we should keep these conversations going outside and further than just this discussion. But one of the questions I wanted to answer that I saw in here in the public chat is who's allowed to join. And we have 3 types of memberships. One is the practitioner clinician membership. So if you are a practicing clinician in anything that's dealing with patients, if you are a physician, PA, nurse practitioner, nurse, therapist, psychologist, pharmacist, anybody in those fields, that's the practitioner. But we also have trainees in those fields, so residents, fellows, and also students, medical students, nursing students. There are different levels. The student level is free. And then we have organizations and corporations like the ones you see some of represented today that can join. And we have 2 forums on the site. One is for clinicians only, because we like to be able to have our discussions and we speak our own little language and we can be vulnerable in there. But in the larger forum where the other organizations can participate, that's where we're having these, the kinds of things that you've got in the Q&A. You can come and ask the people in those industries. Like, we're fostering conversations from the beginning of this movement to get these medicines to patients. So we've got many players in there, like we said, from Numinous making the medicines, Elizabeth and Fluence making the training, Sean and his group working on regulatory and policy issues. We've got those people in there. So head to psychedelicmedicineassociation.org and take a look at the different options for membership. We have courses that you don't even have to, like the courses that Dr. Nielsen is providing, you can get without even joining. They're on the course page. You can see those right at the beginning of our website. We truly appreciate our panelists' time. Thank you so much for joining us for the celebration today. And I appreciate everybody who has joined, because I know that means we're all together in working together to get these to the patients in need and help work in fostering an equitable distribution of these medicines to those who they can help. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Please think about joining the association. We will continue that Q&A in the forum. Thanks everyone.